This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So, welcome to the final Sport and Leisure History Seminar of 2015. I'm very happy to introduce Rohan McWilliam, who's going to be talking today about fancy repositories, the arcades and bazaars of London's West End in the 19th century. Rohan has published widely on 19th century and Victorian culture, published a book on the Tichborne claimants, and I believe this paper is part of a wider project which will be about the West End of London, the history of the West End of London in the 19th and 20th centuries. He's also working on a publication on labour and the left in the 1980s, so obviously that's going to be interesting given the current state of the Labour Party, and some might say it's return to its 80s roots. And he's also working on a new directions in social and cultural history for Bloomsbury, the publishers, and I believe he's looking for people.
Yeah, I have a book series on new directions in social and cultural history, so I am touting for business, actually. Interesting book projects, you know where to come.
Yeah, so the floor's yours, Rohan. Take it away.
Well, brilliant. Thank you very much for inviting me, yes. I know the title is slightly different from the one when you've given up there, but I hope you'll bear with me. Great, thank you. In October 1900, the American journalist in London, Ralph Blumenfeld, noted the following in his diary. I quote, "Shopkeepers in the Burlington Arcade are again complaining about the obstruction caused at the Piccadilly entrance by young bloods from Tufnell Park and Acton and Tooting Bec, who congregate there after 5 o'clock in the afternoon, all dressed up in frock coats, highly polished hats, and lavender gloves. They stand tightly wedged together, leaning on their gold and silver mounted sticks, looking bored, and imagine that they give the impression to passers-by that they are all heirs to peerages and great estates, and are just out for an airing. This afternoon I saw young X, one of our clerks, in this languid group. Now I know why he is always so anxious to get away at 5 o'clock. A strange fad." Now, in a sense, my paper this evening is about deconstructing that episode. We cannot know for certain what was going on in the minds of those young bloods, drawn, you will note, from lower middle class suburbs. Were they there, for example, to eye up the female talent? Were they there to eye up each other? Indeed, was this a kind of queer gathering? But how interesting that they chose to wear what I presume was their Sunday best, although what's described there is a bit better, I think, than Sunday best. How interesting that they chose the Burlington Arcade for this kind of display. How interesting that they emulated not only the aristocracy, but specifically the man about town whose needs the West End of London served. Now, this talk, as Jeff was saying, is derived from a history of the West End of London that I am currently writing. Rather surprisingly, this is a book that has never been written. Okay, we've had many London histories, and certainly histories of the East End, and no one, for some reason, has done the West End, really. And despite its importance in the history of popular culture, mass entertainment, and retail. Now, of course, there are a number of books by people like Judith Walkowitz and Erica Rappaport, which, of course, do talk about aspects of the West End, but no one's ever tried to take the West End as a historical problem over a long period of time, and that's what I seek to do. In the course of the 19th century, the area of central London, stretching from Oxford Street in the north to the Strand in the south, became the capital's pleasure district. And again, I'm really surprised that there's curiously very little literature on pleasure districts and how they function. That seems to be a really important part of urban history, and yet one that still requires a lot more thought. I'm not talking about places like Bath and places like that, which of course have had historians, but very specific places in cities whose purpose is to, essentially to offer a combination of pleasure and retail. In the 19th century, the West End went from being a playground for the elite of Mayfair and St James's to one that provided goods, entertainment, curiosity and delight to a wider public. And it's this transition I am concerned with on this project. By 1900, the West End offered a constellation of theatres, of music halls, of restaurants and exhibition centres. It became a laboratory of mass entertainment and mass culture, setting templates for fashion and style in the modern city. Now, my methodology on this project is to look at particular places and spaces and to think about their cultural work. It seems to me that buildings and objects not only are good to think with, but were good to think with at the time, that they play a role in identity formation. That seems to me the logic of modern cultural history, is to think in those kinds of terms. Buildings, objects, spaces establish the cultural style of the West End, which I take to be that curious combination of ostentation and vulgarity. This, I believe, is what drew those young men from Tufnell Park to the Burlington Arcade. And I'm arguing in this project that the West End possessed a particular kind of discourse, or set of discourses. Indeed, its material culture actually provided it with a discourse, if you like, money talked. The West End offered a world of goods and abundance. And these goods had a charisma of their own because they describe a lifestyle. In the later 19th century, the West End witnessed the rise of the department store. But I want this evening to explore some aspects of shopping before the rise of the department store. I want to talk mainly this evening about the arcades of the West End, though I will also have some comments to make about the bazaars of the West End. They will be relatively brief because I've only actually just really started thinking about that. I've done quite a lot of work on arcades. Now, bazaars and arcades were two forms of retail and two kinds of building that developed at roughly the same time in the late 18th, early 19th century. And they established the template on which the department store was built and based. And I want this evening particularly to draw your attention to the phenomenon of the fancy repository, which I argue this evening provides clues to the cultural work of pleasure districts. And I'll say what fancy repositories are later on. Okay, so let's start with the arcades. Now, the arcade was a phase in retail development that commenced in the late 18th century and barely survived the 19th century. I argue that arcades were part of a process whereby the West End became a magnet, drawing in people through its multiple seductions. This meant that the West End stood for luxury, but also the vicarious pleasure of window shopping and urban spectatorship. Again, that's what those young guys from Tufnell Park were all about. The West End provided spaces to explore what was in fashion and to strut and to parade, discovering what was in and what was out. Its buildings had a psychic charge, and what I seek to do is to try and unpack them as cultural statements. And the arcades also were part of the same cultural project that saw the West End become shaped by monumental theatres. But I argue today that the arcades and the objects they displayed enjoyed a theatricality of their own. Now, arcade building became a common feature of urban life throughout Britain, Europe, and beyond. And this evening, I want to consider the three main arcades of the West End. The Royal Opera Arcade, the Burlington Arcade, and the Lowther Arcade. There were, I should say, a number of other arcades which were not as long-lasting. There is, of course, a case for arguing that Covent Garden Market constitutes an arcade, but I think that's rather a slightly different thing. Now, these arcades that I'm going to talk about were not all the same, as I hope you will discover. They were different kinds of spaces which opened the district to different kinds of public. So what actually is an arcade? What do I actually mean by that? It's a slippery term. You'll find that contemporaries in the 19th century would use terms like piazza, exchange, and indeed the word bazaar would also be used for what I'm going to call an arcade. At the basic level, the arcade is a building with a series of linked arches. The architectural historian Johann Geist describes an arcade as a glass-covered passageway which connects two busy streets and is linked on both sides with shops. Now the key, as you can see here from the Royal Opera Arcade, the Burlington Arcade, is the glass roof, which offers the benefit of natural light for the display of goods. The glass in the shop windows is also important because it allowed for a clear viewing experience, but also allowed consumers to view themselves in pursuit of goods. And again, I wonder, is this what those guys from Tufnell Park were doing? Enjoying the reflection in the window. They could gaze at themselves. Now, the arcades, of course, served a practical purpose in terms of retail. First of all, it allowed customers relief from bad weather and the inevitable mud of London's streets. Secondly, it allowed people to enjoy a range of goods and services that were beyond the capacity of any one shop. And in that sense, of course, arcades anticipated the department store and the shopping mall. They were also models for the development of the railway station precinct. And, perhaps more obviously, the Great Exhibition and the prison. Think about it. Okay. Another feature of the arcades is that they were respectable, but they contained unrespectable elements. Shopping arcades were consciously designed spaces, the work of a single architectural imagination. And they proved to be amongst the first major buildings created on a monumental scale for the emerging consumer society. For that reason, Walter Benjamin saw them not only as the dream worlds of modern capitalism, but as building blocks of modernity. They became a way of embodying the new. In that spirit, arcades in the 19th century generated a number of utopian proposals to reshape London. In 1845, Frederick Guy, director of the Royal Opera, proposed the construction of a glass-covered street that would extend all the way from the Bank of England through to Trafalgar Square. And I think it's significant that it was the theatre manager suggesting this, because I think there are important links, as I'm going to show you, between theatres and arcades. And actually, by the way, I mean, on the West End project, part of my argument, the bigger argument, is about the cross-fertilisation of different spaces and forms. 10 years later, after Frederick Guy, there was a proposal to create the Crystal Way, a circular glass arcade that would run all the way from St Paul's to Oxford Street via the Strand. I mean, it's like something out of H.G. Wells or something. The idea was that they're going to create this huge kind of glass arcade, and there'd be a railway on the ground floor. There'd be 2 floors. There'd be a railway on the ground floor, and then on the first floor there would be shops on top of it. Okay, and this would allow Londoners to get around London. The same year, 1855, Joseph Paxton of the Great Exhibition proposed a glass arcade that would connect all of London's major stations. Now, as you probably realise, none of these proposals got anywhere. Because, of course, the logistics of doing this were so vast. But it's how interesting that they possessed that kind of ambition to use glass and the arcade form in that way. And also it shows how glass itself was becoming the medium through which people began to imagine the city of the future. Arcades were therefore utopian spaces in some respects, and they were threshold spaces. Both Charles Dickens and Henry Mayhew describe the arcades as inevitably Arcadian. Although interesting, that the number of articles is called Arcades and Arcadia. Interestingly enough, they're different words actually. I mean, the word arcade, in my sense, comes from the word arch. That's the derivation, rather than meaning a form of paradise. But in fact, this link to the word Arcadian is interesting, because what Dickens and Mayhew and George Augustus Sala were doing were understanding how identity formation was part of the cultural work of the arcades. The gent, the flaneur, the voyeur, the middle-class hostess and shopper, all these types could find something in the arcades. That's why the arcades were a kind of prototype for what the West End became. Also, I think the idea of the arcades as Arcadian captures something else about their appeal. The thing about arcades is, of course, they're easy to miss or walk past, okay? Which means that they kind of flatter that notion of being in the know. That suddenly you have to know that down this passageway there'll be all this abundance of goods. They also have the utopian promise of a city in miniature. I think they have something of the appeal of the doll's house. Moreover, shops felt provisional. It's significant that actually, if you read a lot of the accounts of the arcades, people refer to the shops not as shops but as bays. People have bays in these arcades. They have all the appeal of the miniature. They offer the simulacrum of a shop. They reference the fact that shops are usually larger. But possibly they have a nostalgic feel. They embody the folk memory of the fact that the early modern shop usually was very small. Hello, Tim. They were also liminal spaces. They combine a sense of privacy and intimacy with what should be its antithesis, conspicuous consumption, objects for display in public. And the arcades are liminal in another sense. They are public space on private property. Okay? Strictly speaking, if you go into the Burlington Arcade, you are on private property. That's why there are beadles, actually, which police it. So it feels public, but actually it's private. However, they offered certain conventional pleasures of shopping. We know that shoppers often developed personal relationships with certain shops, especially including those in the arcades, which they associated with providing high-quality luxury goods that recognise social distinction as well. So the arcades replicated conventional notions of class. They were spaces based upon deference, but also the searching gaze of the shopkeeper who could sort out the people who, to sort out the oiks, essentially. Now, arcades were not entirely new. There were in the 16th century. We had the development of exchanges, such as the Royal Exchange, and there was a craze for in the 18th century for bazaars and spaces like the Vauxhall Gardens, places to promenade. Now, the West End arcades were inspired by the Parisian arcades. That was the model. The Parisian arcades, of course, memorably described by Walter Benjamin as radiating Paris like grottos, and they were built from the late 18th century onwards. And of course, Benjamin famously said that it was the arcades that helped make Paris the capital of the 19th century. It's true that part of the genesis of my West End project was the publication of the Arcades project by Walter Benjamin, and I did a roundtable discussion of that for the Journal of Victorian Culture, and I thought I tried to find somebody who would basically try and apply the Arcades project to the West End. I couldn't get anyone to do it. Okay, and in a sense, I thought, well, part of what I'm trying to do is to try and do that. That said, I'm not presenting this as a Benjaminian interpretation, partly because I have to admit I'm not quite sure what that is. Okay, but that is some of the sort of genesis of this. I think arcades should be seen in the period as part of a wider Anglo-French cultural conversation in which new technology and cultural forms crisscrossed the channel in the Age of Revolution, say between 1780 and 1850. I'm thinking about panoramas, I'm thinking about fashionable dress, I'm thinking of the restaurant, I'm thinking of the Gothic, I'm thinking about melodrama, I'm thinking of the serialised novel. This is part of that wider Anglo-French cultural conversation. No surprise that West End arcades were based on a construction of cosmopolitanism, because they appeared to offer a conduit to the best that Paris had to offer, a Parisian, French, classy Parisian goods. Regent Street, built at the same time, of course, does much the same thing. And again, the larger payoff of this is these are the things that help turn London into a world city, based on international networks of taste, fashion, and finance. So at the end of the day, folks, you don't compare London with Macclesfield. You compare it with Paris, you compare it with New York, you compare it with Tokyo. It's a world city. Now, the first arcade in the West End and in Britain was almost an accident. It was an accident. People didn't intend to build it. It was the Royal Opera Arcade, which was a byproduct of John Nash's Regent Street, built between roughly 1813 and 1823. Nash, as part of that, architecturally linked what was then the King's Theatre on the Haymarket to Regent Street, which is now the Her Majesty's Theatre, the Phantom of the Opera Theatre. Okay, and he threw a Doric colonnade all around the block, and that left a space at the back of the theatre. And so Nash, in 1817, filled it with an arcade, the Royal Opera Arcade, because the King's Theatre was the great opera house before Covent Garden was an opera house. It was the King's Theatre. He filled it with an arcade on the Parisian model in 1817. This is a photograph of the Royal Opera Arcade now. He created a long corridor with 18 bays and circular skylights. Now, the Royal Opera Arcade always retained, certainly in the 19th century, its link to the theatre. In fact, there was an entrance for the aristocracy to go into the boxes of the King's Theatre from the arcade itself round the back. They wouldn't go in round the front. They'd go in through a special entrance, which is no longer there, in the back. Also, the shops offered places to buy programmes and to deposit coats. And rather unusually, you could purchase or hire opera glasses from a fishing tackle shop. I know. Okay, but this kind of heightened that sense of exclusivity, that this was the place for the toffs to get into the theatre. And the shops came to serve the needs of Clubland London, of Mayfair and St James's, which is why at one point it was known as Fops Walk. Now, the Royal Opera Arcade has never been that successful in commercial terms. I've done a study of post office directories between 1841 and 1901, and I've shown that very quickly the Royal Opera Arcade became identified with bootmakers. In 1901, of the 12 bays in the arcade, 6 were bootmakers. But it served a variety of masculine needs. For example, Gladstone would buy his ties from John Mann's hosiery shop on the arcade. And one of the things I've made use of on this project, a book I'm surprised no one has used that much, because I found it's incredibly rich, is Henry Mayhew's book on shops. I mean, not London Labour and London Poor, but this book he did on shops in 1861, which and a lot of it's about West End shops, which is very convenient. And one of the things that Mayhew says, which I think is quite brilliant, is he captures the doleful aspect of this passage. I mean, he considered it narrow and badly lit, but he drew attention to one intriguing feature: the fact that you rarely ever see anyone in this arcade, and you see, and it's full of shops with no one in them. And that's true now, and it was true. You walk down, there's just like nobody in these shops. Or if you do see a shopkeeper, they look at you suspiciously. The fact that you might have even interested in going into this place, you get this suspicious look. Okay, you get that now. Mayhew, perhaps not surprisingly, caught that back in 1861. Far more successful, far more iconic was the Burlington Arcade. Which I expect many of you will know, on Piccadilly. Now, it was created by Lord George Cavendish, owner of Burlington House on Piccadilly. And he was annoyed that there was this passageway on the western side of Burlington House was being used by passers-by to throw rubbish into his garden in Burlington House. And the story goes that one day he was sunning himself in the back garden and someone threw a dead cat over the wall and it hit him. So and he started, and when he was hit by the dead cat, enough was enough. So he turned the avenue into an enclosed arcade designed by Samuel Ware, again on the Parisian model. And it opened in 1819, and it promptly established itself as the venue for the beau monde. It was a big success. It had 72 bays on it. They were immediately rented. And the smallness of the bays meant they offered an intimate, even domestic atmosphere. Whilst the Beadles, as I said earlier, proclaimed that this was a place of safety. You didn't need to get worried too much coming into it. And indeed, the Burlington Arcade then inspired the building of refined arcades, really throughout Britain and indeed elsewhere in the world. And many city centres will have arcades of various kinds. I first gave this paper at a conference in Leeds, at Leeds Trinity. And of course, and I did make the point, of course, that Leeds itself must be one of the most arcaded city centres that there is. I mean, it's and the Leeds arcades are absolutely stunning, I think. Now, like Regent Street, the Burlington Arcade was intended for luxury. For example, in 1861, it boasted 4 jewellery shops. George Augustus Sala, who I'm trying to retrieve as kind of the major commentator that I think he really was. He's just coming into his own now, I think. I think a lot of us need to sort of really go back to Sala and really put him into the picture. George Augustus Sala noted that the shops of the Burlington Arcade, I quote, sold no articles of positive necessity. The useful arts were repellent to Burlingtonian notions of industry, and luxury was almost exclusively provided for. Burlington was intensely aristocratic. And what would you buy in the Burlington Arcade? Well, Sala very handily gives us a list of items. Jewellery, fans, feathers, French novels, pictorial albums, annuals, scrapbooks, caricatures, harps, accordions, quadrille music, illuminated polkas, toys, scents, hairbrushes, odoriferous vinegar, Rowland's Macassar oil, snuff boxes, jewelled whips, clouded canes, lemon-coloured gloves, and false whiskers. You get the picture. Now, it is worth saying that many of these shops went beyond simply frivolous items and, if you like, frivolous clothing. For example, there were a number of hairdressers for both men and women. But even here, I think there's a difference. Sala says, boots and shoes and gloves were certainly sold on the Burlington Arcade, but they fitted only the most Byronically small and symmetrical hands and feet. None but the finest odoriferous leathers were employed in their confection, and none but the highest prices charged for them. Now, one thing I want to draw out of that was the way in which the Burlington Arcade began to cater for a female market, in contrast to the Royal Opera Arcade. Female shoppers, of course, predominated on the arcade, at least to some extent, and a large number of shops were actually owned by women, again going by the post office directories. And these shops were meant to evoke Parisian sophistication. But there were other aspects to the arcade which perhaps were less respectable. There was, for example, William Jeffs's bookshop, which in many ways was respectable. It was the leading bookshop in the mid-Victorian years to buy French literature. George Eliot met her partner, George Henry Lewis, in Jeffs's bookshop on the Burlington Arcade. Many French refugees would congregate there because in the mid-Victorian years it was the place to go to for anti-Napoleon III propaganda. But it also included it would sell the racy novels of Paul de Kock and other spicy French authors, including Eugène Sue, Georges Sand, and Alexandre Dumas, who at that point was actually seen as slightly racy, not how he is seen now. Mayhew also talked about print shops on the arcade, which included sketches of ballet girls on tinted paper, which are principally distinguished for their intense impudence of face, brevity of petticoat, and development of leg. Okay, you get the picture. The heroine of Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon buys French novels from the Burlington Arcade, and if you know Lady Audley's Secret, you'll know that's not a good thing. Just this great femme fatale. Now, so in one sense, this was a controlled space. It actually had beadles. It was policed. It still is, by the way. And smoking, for example, was forbidden on the Burlington Arcade. There was also no whistling or singing. And also, servants couldn't bring prams onto the Burlington Arcade. The reason for this was that female servants would bring prams onto the arcade, and their soldiers would follow them to try and chat them up. Okay, so this led to prams getting banned from the Burlington Arcade. So in one sense, we are talking about a controlled space. In fact, I'll go back to that one. So in one sense, a controlled space, but in another sense, it was uncontrolled. It was notorious for the Cyprians of the better sort who would solicit there. Indeed, right from the start of its history, the Burlington Arcade was associated with prostitution. Prostitutes would wear elegant clothes to blend in. I'm quite interested in the clothing of prostitutes, which are kind of a parody of what a female aristocrat would wear. I think that's what's sort of going on there. Sex workers used what was called the Pantheon intricacies of the arcade, and they employed a series of signals to potential customers to solicit custom, and they would then use a friendly bonnet shop on the arcade, the upstairs bit of it. We know this from Mayhew. Actually, there's a number of other sources. In fact, Mayhew talks about the feet of the prostitutes being what he calls bien chaussées, well shod, if you like. Their elegant footwear blending in with the rest of the women on the arcade. And respectable men would apparently avoid the arcade in the later afternoon because of a fear that it would suggest that they were looking for prostitutes. What's more, shop girls were often ogled by men fresh from their clubs and considered as potential sex workers. This is from the Illustrated London News. It's not actually of the Burlington Arcade per se. I mean, it doesn't, but I kind of think it captures that sort of experience, the male gaze or what. It's significant also that the cross-dressers, Bolton and Park, would frequent the arcade in the 1870s, notorious for wearing men for wearing women's clothing. They eventually got done for wearing women's clothing in theatres, but again, I think it's how interesting that they're parading in the arcades, they're parading in the theatres as well. There's that link, and the reputation of the Burlington Arcade actually prevented a similar arcade being built in Oxford Street, because the argument was made is if you have one of these places in Oxford Street, you'll get prostitution. Okay, so it's not just Mayhew. I mean, a lot of people knew about this. But what it does reveal is that the arcades were a performance space, and the West End was a space that conferred a range of identities. Consumerism, fashion, performance, courtship and spectacle were the stock in trade of the West End. It combined respectable and unrespectable elements. It stood for luxury and decorum. But it also stood for the continuation of an 18th century world of aristocratic vice and frivolity, untainted by Victorianism. Okay, that's kind of, I think, what's going on here. I now want to talk about a rather different. Let me just show you. This is a picture of a prostitute on the Burlington Arcade, actually bribing the beadle to look the other way. Okay, and so again, that sort of suggests that a lot of people were kind of in on this. But I will, however, share one thing that's running through my mind, and this is this thing about how respectable men wouldn't frequent the arcade in the late afternoon. I presume it was okay for kind of respectable women to do that. Well, it may be that the Beatles didn't do anything about it because they'd been bribed. But I find it very weird. If I was a shopkeeper on the Burlington Arcade and prostitution was preventing custom coming in, that would hit my custom. And I find that very odd. That if I had to put up with that. So I just wonder about that. But anyway, that's just a rumination. A very different space was the Lowther Arcade, built on the Strand in 1831. And if you feel you don't know it, that's because it doesn't exist anymore. And it was a very different kind of arcade, but it owed its origins, again, to the wave of modernisation in London unleashed by John Nash, the architect who built Regent Street. But in this case, it was Nash's rebuilding to ease the traffic congestion on the Strand. And this was part of the clearance programme of central London that created Trafalgar Square. Now, the Lowther Arcade was built in 1831 in a move that was designed to offset the shift of West End custom further north. And I think there is a kind of sense, which I'm trying to document, in which the kind of what we associate as the pleasure district, the beginning of the 19th century, is around the Strand and Covent Garden. And then what we see is the pleasure district moving north, up to Leicester Square, up to Piccadilly Circus, up to Oxford Street. Okay, there's a kind of shift northwards. That's the story, if you like, of my book. The Lowther Arcade took its inspiration from the Parisian arcades, particularly the Passage de Panoramas. And its architecture, with its pendentive cupolas, was thought to actually surpass the Burlington Arcade. And in fact, we've only got this picture to go on, actually. But yeah, I think that's probably true. It was named after Lord Lowther, former Chief Commissioner of Woods and Forests. And if you want to know where it was diagonally opposite what is now Charing Cross Station. Charing Cross Station wasn't actually built until 1864. But if you want to know where it was, you come out of Charing Cross Station, it's diagonally opposite you where Cootes Bank is now. If you know that on the Strand, it's there. You may remember that in the final problem, Dr. Watson uses the Lowther Arcade to escape the henchmen of Moriarty. And indeed, the arcade lasted until 1901, when Cootes Bank actually took over that site. But the Lowther Arcade was different in other ways from the Burlington Arcade. It was different because it was built 10 years later. And it was different because of its position on the Strand rather than Piccadilly. The West End, by this time, was beginning to take on new forms of identity, offering pleasures for a wider public. I think there was a democratisation of pleasure in the 19th century. It was assisted, first of all, by the development of the omnibus system from the end of the 1820s, which of course allows people from the suburbs to come in. It's obviously later on assisted by the development of railway stations and the railways, like Charing Cross Station. And so the Lowther Arcade pursued a more middle-class clientele than the Burlington Arcade. Now, it offered shops, as did Burlington, but it also contained the Gallery of Practical Science, which later became the Royal Adelaide Gallery. And this offered exhibits devoted to science and art. On the lower ground floor, if you went to the gallery, you would find fossils and John Adcock's condensing steam engine. Okay, so the best of sort of science and technology. And the upper floor would feature paintings such as John Martin's great canvas of the Fall of Nineveh. From the 1860s, the block also contained Gatti's restaurant. I've been doing a lot of work on the whole Gatti food and theatre empire. And Gatti's catered particularly for clerks and foreign nationals. A lot of French political refugees would meet up at Gatti's and plot revolution and revenge on Napoleon III. It was also notorious for prostitution. So what you have here in this space are links between exhibition culture, between sex, food, the world of goods. It's a relatively self-contained retail and entertainment space that I think anticipates the modern shopping mall. Now, there were a variety of shops initially on the arcade. There were tailors, milliners, hosiers, hairdressers. So similar to the Burlington Arcade, but aimed, as I said, at a middle-class audience. Dickens would frequent it. And there also, and of course you do not see this in this picture, but there would also be stalls running up and down the passage with people selling things. So in some respects, it resembled a bazaar. Okay. and I'll come back to that. But very quickly, the Lowther Arcade became taken over by what were called fancy repositories. Now, these shops sold a variety of knickknacks and other goods, including embroidery, pin cushions, paper flower making sets, varieties of goods aimed at the hobbyist, that kind of thing. I did an n-gram search on fancy repository and I found the use of the term spikes dramatically in the 1860s. If we use the street directories, we find that in 1861, of 19 shops on the Lowther Arcade, 11 called themselves fancy repositories. By 1881, of the 18 shops that were there, 14 used the term. Okay, so there's a takeover of the Lowther Arcade by the fancy repository. And let's think about that word, that term, fancy repository. Let's say that word, fancy, a really interesting word. Again, thank you, Ngram. I discovered that we still use the word fancy in all sorts of ways. The Victorians used the term word fancy twice as much as people in the 20th century do. I did not expect that. So it's a really kind of loaded common word in the 19th century, which carries associations of arbitrary caprice, fantasy, luxury, the unusual, the special, the entertaining. The term was heavily used by many shops, and I argue that it helped shape that discourse of the West End. The West End was there for the fancy, to be a repository for the fancy, with fancy goods, containing the possibilities of the exotic. Mayhew describes the prevalence on the Lowther Arcade of cheap bohemian glass, purses, and vases of flowers under glass cases, that kind of thing. He says, these trinkets, interesting word, trinkets, these trinkets are so much affected by the modern Arcadian, and they have this advantage, that they are cheap and do not last long. Okay, so it's kind of a sort of trivial tat, essentially. Now, the fancy repository, in practice, came to mean toy shops, and quickly the Lowther Arcade became associated with the toy industry. It was the place to go and buy toys in London. And I argue that this is significant because not only is the West End then being opened up to the middle class in various ways, but it's being opened up to the children of the middle class. And indeed, one of the ways in which the middle class come in is via their children. And I think it's significant that the Lowther Arcade emerged at just the moment when the pantomime was becoming aimed at children. And indeed, this helped it endow its goods with a peculiar kind of enchantment. So at Christmas, for example, children would come into the pantomimes up Drury Lane famously, but also be taken to the Lowther Arcade to buy a toy. And at Christmas, there would be additional toy stalls, and here they are. Okay. Now, in the 1830s, I think it's interesting to put this in context. I mentioned this as being aimed at the children of the middle class. I do mean that to a large extent. In the 1830s, when it was built, childhood was still a category that was actually denied in many ways to the children of the poor. If we read Mayhew, children were, certainly in the early Victorian period, were as likely to be selling toys as to be playing with them. Now, what was particularly appealing for children about the Lowther Arcade, and you can kind of see evidence of this here, was its tactile quality. Shop girls would allow children to handle toys, okay, which of course the children is really cool. So that made just even a visit to the arcade, let alone buying anything, a visit would become fun in itself. I mean, this is a space, the classic space, based upon pester power. And yeah, I think the world of the toy itself is, I think, really interesting. I mean, I'm supervising a PhD on the toy soldier at the moment in post-war Britain. What's interesting about the toy is it usually represents an adult view of what a child wants, because of course it's an adult who makes the toy, and indeed it's usually an adult who purchases the toy. And indeed, toys have a kind of Proustian charge in that they represent adult nostalgia for the memory of their children. People try to inflict their own childhoods, of course, on their own children. But I think this is an interesting space, it seems to me, because it allowed for the complex negotiation between adult and child. One contemporary recalled the difficulty of choosing the right thing for a child, and he said it was much easier to select a wedding present for his wife than it was to pick the right toy. And I think this is interesting in terms of the history of childhood, because it places the child in a peculiar position. The adult is doing the purchasing, but he or she desperately wants to please the child. So I think we need to recover toy shops as crucial spaces in the history of childhood. They're part, of course, of the sentimentalisation of childhood. We know that in the 19th century. But what's interesting here is that this is the moment when the adult becomes the supplicant to the child, to act that relationship, to get the toy right. And we should recover these spaces as being important locations for the development of children's consumerism. And in fact, this is possibly one of the first moments when you can actually talk about that, about sort of children's consumerism. Now, London, however, was unusual in having toy shops as early as the late 18th century. Hamley's began as a shop on High Holborn in 1760. Later on, of course, moved to where it is now, on Regent Street. Now, the toys of the Lowther Arcade were notoriously cheap. Jane Carlyle described it as, I quote, the most rubbishy place in London. She had to go to a Christmas gathering with loads of children, and she managed to buy presents for 48 children for just £2, 12 shillings. George Augustus Sala described what you might find at the Burlington Arcade. He talks about French toys, fierce toys, warlike toys, smelling of young France and glory and blood, such as miniature cannon, lancers, war streamers, muskets, and tricoloured flags surmounted by the resuscitated eagle of France. And there were German toys, which, like everything coming from Deutschland, are somewhat quaint and somewhat eccentric, a touch misty. For example, queer old carved men and women, queer attitudes, and animals whose anatomy is likewise of the queerest kind. Tortuous games played with hammers and dice and little men, which remind you somehow of Rhine Schlossers and gnomes and Undine and Albrecht Dürer's maid. Then the Germans like to have monks and hermits who open little chapels like dolls' houses and oratories with little altars and candles and priests. And who but the Germans, too, would make long panoramas and dioramas, opening in the accordion manner, and strange monsters in boxes. Now, what I want to take from that description, though, first of all, it tells us something about kind of the cosmopolitanism of children's culture. Germany was the centre of the toy industry to a large extent. You get French toys, but Belgian toys to some extent, but Germany is really important in terms of producing toys. It also tells us something about the role of the Gothic in children's toys, which I think is really important. And indeed, I think it allows us to start talking about something I don't know anyone's ever talked about in the whole, all that literature on the Gothic. People don't talk about children's Gothic as such. It seems to me that it's got, or at least in terms of toys, that seems to be one of the spaces for the propagation of the Gothic. Here, by the way, is another picture of the Lowther Arcade at Christmas. Now, the Lowther Arcade is thought to have been influenced by the Soho Bazaar. So let me just finish that, just make a few comments about the Bazaar. Now, I take the Bazaar to be a similar space to the arcade, but slightly different. By a bazaar, I mean a large hall with stalls, rather than arcades, which had separate shops. Okay, and rather than looking to the French model, it deliberately tried to evoke the Oriental bazaar. So there's a kind of Orientalist dimension to the bazaar. Although one would also have to say that a more obvious inspiration for the bazaar, quite simply, is the market. I mean, of course, remember, in this period, most food is bought from open-air markets, well into the 19th century. Now, the Soho Bazaar owed its origins to the Napoleonic Wars in this sense. It was founded by a businessman called John Trotter in 1815, who made a fortune supplying the army in the Napoleonic Wars. And he turned a warehouse in Soho Square into a bazaar to help the widows and daughters of men who had been killed in the war. Okay, and so they could literally set up shop in the bazaar. They had to rent a stall, and they could sell fancy goods. And about 200 women rented stalls, and they would sell things like shawls, hats, toys. And this created, I'm sorry that I do not have a picture of the interior of the Soho Bazaar. I am looking for one. I hope one will turn up. But this Soho Bazaar created a craze for bazaars throughout London, indeed elsewhere. And it lasted up to 1885. But the most significant of this craze for bazaars was the Pantheon on Oxford Street. Now, the Pantheon was originally a theatre. Again, there are my links between arcades, bazaars, theatres. It was a theatre that had been built in 1772, which had enjoyed only intermittent success. And so in 1834, it was rebuilt as a bazaar. And here it is. And it was noted in particular for its interior glass house. I mean, it had a glass roof, but it also had a glass house, which was like a conservatory with flowers, birds, and fountains, which was ornamented in Saracenic style. Again, there's that sort of Orientalist drive. And like the Soho Bazaar, you could buy trinkets, you could buy toys, you could buy jewellery. But on the upper level, because you can see it's on multiple levels, on the upper level you could buy pictures and also birds you could buy for sale. So in other words, it was a kind of ultra fancy repository. And it was particularly frequented by men about town. In 1842, Punch said it combined the attractions of the Zoological Gardens and the National Gallery, okay, because of the birds you could buy and the pictures. And it talked about men about town walking around, promenading around the galleries and looking down essentially on the hoi polloi with the high bearing of the person who has been fortunate enough to get in an order for a private box at the theatres and who then looks down at the occupants of the pit. Okay, and so that's what captures, I think, something of what was going on there, and it became seen as the foremost bazaar in London, although it did close in 1867. Isabel Armstrong, in her wonderful book Victorian Glasswork, describes it as a kind of hybrid of bazaar and arcade, which I think is probably true. But I think its multiple functions meant that it really this is what really anticipates the department store. Okay, it seems to me that this is the kind of space that we then start to recognise as the department store, a space which allows for things like window shopping. Now, to conclude, I've argued this evening that arcades and bazaars were an important part of the making of the West End into a pleasure district. This is why the West End became a magnet. These kinds of spaces are what drew in those young men from Tufnell Park and Acton. I've contrasted the masculine world of the Royal Opera Arcade with the more feminine spaces elsewhere in the arcades. The Royal Opera Arcade and the Burlington Arcade certainly serviced the Mayfair elite, but the Lowther Arcade and the Bazaars broadened the appeal, certainly to the middle class. And they sold contrasting kinds of objects. I've contrasted the high-end luxury goods of Burlington with the cheap knickknacks of the Lowther Arcade. But either way, the arcades and the bazaars of the West End carried the aura of prestige. And for that reason, their objects contained a kind of cultural capital, which is, of course, the purpose of pleasure districts. We find the discourse of the West End in the delicate shoes of the Burlington Arcade, the overly decorated Bohemian glass in the Oxford Street Pantheon, the tin drums of the Lowther Arcade, and we find it in the knowing wink of the sex worker. Thank you very much.